Good morning, everybody. Good morning, and thank you. It's wonderful to see such a full house for this morning's briefing, The Politics of Gender, Women, Men, and the 2016 Campaign. I think it's pretty clear that people are hungry for this conversation. I hope you're all well caffeinated and ready to go. I am Margaret Lowe. I'm president of Atlantic Live, which is the events division of The Atlantic. The role of gender was at the forefront in the 2016 presidential election. Everybody here knows the story well, but I think because it's the backdrop of our conversation this morning, it bears repeating. Hillary Clinton was the first woman in this country's history to become her party's nominee for the presidency. She was widely touted as having more relevant experience than either Barack Obama or her husband, Bill Clinton, in their first bids for the White House. Meanwhile, President-elect Donald Trump was a billionaire businessman with a populist message to make America great again, but he was widely criticized for his sexist rhetoric about women, and after the Access Hollywood tapes were released, many political observers thought his bid for the White House was over. And the juxtaposition of these two candidates fueled a real national conversation about feminism and sexism and the role of gender. In the end, most women did vote for Hillary Clinton, but it was white women who helped put Donald Trump over the top. Nearly 2 out of 3 non-college educated white women voted for Donald Trump. And there are dozens of ways to slice the numbers, of course, but it all raises the question, how much was gender an issue in the final tally? So this morning we're going to explore the politics of gender with people who spend a lot of time thinking about and writing about and talking about these issues. Before I get started, I do want to thank our underwriters for this event, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation and the Center for American Women in Politics. The two organizations partnered to produce a study called the Presidential Gender Watch 2016, which will be released earlier in the new year and next year. Thank you to the foundation. Without their support, conversations like this one simply would not be possible. A few quick, more mundane notes. Please silence your cell phones. Don't put them away because we'd love you to join the conversation on Twitter. We're at Atlantic_live, and we're using the hashtag ATLPoliticsPolicy, no and, just ATL Politics Policy. We also want you to be part of the conversation in the room, so think about your questions. We'll be asking you for your questions after every session. And now let's roll with the first conversation, tackling the question at hand, did gender matter? Here to help answer that question, please welcome Melissa Harris Perry. She's a political commentator and a professor of politics and international affairs at Wake Forest University. Welcome, Melissa. Jen O'Malley Dillon was Barack Obama's 2012 deputy campaign manager, and she's co-founder of Precision Strategies, a strategic communications firm, and the executive vice president of public affairs at PSB Research, Margie O'Meara. Margie is a longtime Democratic pollster. Here to lead the conversation is my colleague, The Atlantic's Peter Beinart, who wrote Fear of a Female President for The Atlantic's October issue. Peter, take it away.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. So why don't we start right in where Margaret left off, and I'll start with you, Melissa. There was a lot of conventional wisdom during the campaign that Donald Trump could not be president because he was going to get creamed among female voters. In fact, he won 53% of white women voters, and I think 62%, close to 2/3 of white working class women voters. So why was the conventional wisdom so wrong?
So I live in North Carolina. I had long been predicting that Mr. Trump was going to win the presidency. I'd actually had a great deal of difficulty actually placing a piece suggesting that on the site that I write for. I think in part because, and I understand if I were an editor, I probably also would not have published it. But for me, the conventional wisdom, if that's in fact what it is, ought to have suggested that about 50-some% of white women were going to vote for Mr. Trump because they vote for the Republican Party consistently. So 53% of white women voting for the Republican candidate is not at all unheard of. If you lived in North Carolina and many other places, you would see that really ordinary people were going to vote for Mr. Trump. What I don't like is an analysis that suggests that all Trump voters were these sort of three-headed persons. As soon as you lived in a place where, when you went to the grocery store or the gas station, your friends and colleagues who you know and spend time with had Trump stickers, you're like, oh, I see. Normal people are going to vote for Mr. Trump. And once you realize that, then you could have expected, I think, or begun to realize that we were in a more normal election cycle than you might otherwise have expected. Under those circumstances, for me, then the key was going to be, as it had been in 2008 and 2012, African American women voters. And in fact, I think when we look at it, the drop-off is really about not the percentage of African American women voters who gave their votes to Hillary Clinton, because again, we overwhelmingly showed up for her, but the percentage of the overall electorate that we were. And so we made up a smaller proportion of the electorate, suggesting that there was either suppression or potentially in addition to somewhat less enthusiasm about Hillary Clinton's campaign. And I suggest actually probably those two things went together. There was somewhat less enthusiasm, a little less effort to get out Black women's votes, and of course suppression efforts in a variety of the states where we could have made a difference, North Carolina being one of them.
And before we go to the other two panelists, can I just ask you a little more about that, about the lack of enthusiasm? What do you think explains the lack of enthusiasm?
Well, so in both 2008 and 2012, African American women's overwhelming support for President Obama, and again, not just the percent support, but the percent of the electorate that we made up, was historic, right? We outperformed every other race, gender, demographic, despite the fact that we have less educational attainment, less income, all the other things that ought to be related to, that are correlated with voter turnout. So we overcame every single barrier. So under what circumstances does a population overcome every single barrier in order to turn out to vote? So I think in 2008 and 2012, there are a number of extremely important symbolic and substantive reasons that Black women show up for the Obamas, both Barack and the First Lady. For me, when I look at the Clinton campaign, there were a number of missed opportunities, both in the campaign, but also in the party more broadly. So, for example, I think the failure to nominate an African American woman for the Supreme Court is one. I think if an African American woman nominee had been languishing in the way that, for example, our Attorney General had been languishing, if you look at what happened around Loretta Lynch, when it became a kind of count every single day, sisters were not having it. Black women showed up. It became very clear that Loretta Lynch's nomination and her confirmation depended in part on Black women's ability to show up and show out. So I think if Black women had understood and believed and had on the line, for example, an African American woman Supreme Court nominee who would not have been confirmed, would have been languishing in the same way that Garlic Marin was, but not just sort of the court is at stake, but this woman is at stake. That is, for example, one way in which the Obama administration might have helped in this effort to make sure that whomever the Democratic nominee was would have had that kind of effort. I think the ways in which, for example, the mothers of the movement were used in sort of rooms here and there, they were traveling around, but they weren't on urban radio. They weren't part of a national television campaign. The fact that the Clinton campaign had extraordinary African American women working for it, but they weren't forefronted. Unless you were an insider, you didn't know about these women. So I think that there were a number of ways, again, in which it was as though no one inside of the party understood how to run a crosstab. They kept talking about women voters. It's not women who vote for the Democratic Party, it's Black women.
Totally fascinating. Jen, a lot was made of the fact that Hillary Clinton emphasized the historic nature of her candidacy more this time around than she had in 2008. Do you think that ultimately mattered? Did it help her? Did it hurt her? Did it both help and hurt her? Or was ultimately that decision ultimately end up being irrelevant to the outcome?
Well, I think with all things in this election, there's not one simple yes or no answer to this. I think that it is certainly It was important for her to acknowledge that she was a woman running for office. I think that it was much more important for her to do it this cycle than I think probably she felt comfortable doing or was able to do in 2008. There is no doubt that there are many, many millions of women that really responded to that. And that was powerful and impactful. But at the same time, she was walking a tightrope to make sure that she didn't emphasize that too much or too little, that she had the right calibration no matter who she was talking to. And I think the broader problem here is that gender is still a problem when you're running for office and leadership. And I think that we are seeing both men and women are still not as comfortable as Hillary Clinton needed them to be president and to run for president, to show the ambition that she wanted to become and should be president. We all well know, of course, here in this room that when Hillary Clinton and other women are in office, their favorability is much higher than when they're running. And so, I think that sort of unpacks a lot of challenges that we continue to face. I think certainly the Clinton campaign made a lot of mistakes. Every campaign makes a lot of mistakes. It's always, President Obama's campaign, which, I was on, we made a lot of mistakes too, but we don't have to talk about that as much because we won, which I'm glad about. But, the reality is there's a lot that they could control as a campaign that, you could point to several areas that, maybe they could have done better. There's a lot that they couldn't control, and there's a lot that they just had to be perfect on. And the reason they had to be perfect was because she was a woman, and that carried through for every aspect of what that campaign did.
Can you say a little bit more about the dynamics involved in women, some women, also, in addition to, like men, being more resistant to women in power, and why does that tend to subside once they actually hold the job, which is why do people become more approving of women when they actually wield power than when they're seeking power?
Well, I'm a campaign strategist, so there are people that could speak much deeper to. You yourself had a great piece on talking about this. I think fundamentally the answer that the campaign had to address was how to talk to women. And women are not one group. We're saying women, they're not monolithic. And at the end of the day, part of what we as campaign strategists in the Clinton campaign needed to think about is how do you engage two people, including women, and have a two-way conversation and really identify what matters. How do you want to engage? How do you want to be part of this? And build that framework to wrap around people so that they can participate and break down some of the barriers that still exist. We know absolutely that there are many people that said after the election, I wish I was more public with my support for Hillary Clinton, but they didn't feel that comfortable. Or they would say, I support Hillary Clinton, but. President Obama broke past that, and you couldn't turn around in most places, even in many of the areas that Hillary Clinton lost, without seeing great support. So that all these layers overlap into each other. But I think one of the things in 2012 we really tapped in on was people working their own networks and being able to reach out beyond beyond what the campaign was doing to say to their friends and family, I support President Obama, here's why, you should too, here's how I'm volunteering. And I think there was a level of that was lost. And part of that is because I think there's still some traditional norms that exist in this country that women and men feel. I remember when I first worked in politics, my mom said, well, your candidate just doesn't look as presidential as this older white fellow. And my mother is as liberal as they come, but there's a baked-in level of this that I think that we needed to be very deliberate about, and some of that is to build the personal connections there that I think perhaps is where we miss around the edges in some instances on the campaign.
Margie, there was this period in the campaign when the Access Hollywood tape came out, and then woman after woman was coming forward about things that they said Donald Trump had done. And I mean, there were even a moment when, prominent Republicans were saying that Donald Trump should actually get off the ticket. It was that level of feeling like this was the end for his campaign. The media played the story very, very big, understandably, and yet it turned out not to be as big a deal politically as I certainly thought it would be, and it seemed like even a lot of Republicans thought it would be. I wonder if you can try to talk a little bit about why this turned out not to be as important as people thought it would be.
Yeah, it was supposed to be the year we tried to decide if we were ready for a woman president, and instead we decided we were ready for an admitted sexual abuser to be president, and that's That's clearly, that's what was so, one of the many insane things of this election was that week where people thought, okay, well, this is truly the last straw. And it, in fact, it just reflected what was already a calcified image of him. It was not a surprise to folks to see that Trump behaved in a boorish way in private as he had in public. And I think for a lot of people, I guess I would say a couple things. Just like we don't know how much of support or a lack of support for Clinton had to do with gender and how much of it is because of something else, partisanship or something specific about her as a candidate. That's an academic question that is not so clear cut. It's not 100% is sexism. It's not 0%. Just like we don't know for Trump, how much is the acceptance of some of these really very unusual behaviors that he had demonstrated over the course of the campaign. How much is it because people liked it, they appreciate it? How much is because he was an entertainer, so they had a different filter, they had a different lens through which they looked at him? You saw in the exit polls, 2/3 of folks who voted said that he didn't have the right temperament, 2/3 said he didn't have the right experience, 1/5 of those voted for him anyway. So there were some who said, I know that he's flawed, I'm doing it anyway, for a variety of reasons. They all have, there are a variety of different reasons, but there are folks who voted for him anyway, and there are folks who enjoy that aspect. So there are both. I think that we saw, and this is true of women and men, this is not specific to men, that there was this acceptance of Trump's behavior because they liked some other piece of what he was offering. Change, something new, willingness to do something, unusual, sort of drain the swamp, blow things up, that people appreciated or at least found refreshing. And that was true for both women and men. It was no surprise to women in our focus groups that men behaved badly. And just like there was no surprise to men. And you saw that in the polling where there was some division. It really depended on how you asked it. Did you think it was, did people think it was sort of normal behavior? Did they approve of it? Those are different kinds of questions. Did they think it was going to hurt him in his campaign? Well, you get a different answer. So it really depended on how people were asked about it, the frame that people used. And I think in the end, you had so many other big events leading up to the election, whether the Comey letter, the debate, that all happened after the Access Hollywood tapes, that receded into the background, amazingly. So I think that for when we think about the election and think about how we talk about Trump and his views toward women or his views toward race, that the more, it's a theory that potentially there's some research for it, that the more you push and emphasize how extreme he is, the more some of his supporters dig in to the belief that that's okay. They're less likely to move. So there was some preliminary research at the University of Maryland. This was on race, not on gender, where they did an experiment and calling out Trump's views on race did nothing to change the views of whites, not liberal whites, but whites who were harboring a bit of racial resentment. Didn't move them at all. That this circling and highlighting and underlining of racism and sexism does not move people because people say, well, I kind of support how Trump feels about X, Y, and Z. Are you saying that I'm racist, or are you saying that I'm sexist? And that people want to dig in their heels a little bit. So I think some of that was happening too. So there were, it was not inconsistent with how they viewed him. There were a lot of other things that happened after that moment, headed into the election. And for some voters, it was, they didn't want to be called, painted with the same brush that people were painting Trump. So I think all of those things were contribute to why Access Hollywood tapes weren't in the end disqualifying.
Melissa, you're a professor. You spend a lot of time with young people. So I'm really interested to know what has been the impact on the young women who you teach of this failure to have this breakthrough and to have someone with the record of Donald Trump, multiple accusations of sexual assault to be a president. And I'm equally interested, what's been the reaction, what's been the impact, what's been the reaction among young men?
Sure. So I was truly privileged all year to lead a program called Wake the Vote. We had 30 students, Democrats and Republicans, who had a very intense experience traveling together. We call it Iowa to the inauguration, so we're not quite done. We will be back here in a month. And they worked together in Iowa and New Hampshire, both South Carolina primaries, North Carolina. We went to both Cleveland and Philadelphia together. They did 90 hours of campaign work over the course of the summer, and then a ton of get out the vote and voter work in North Carolina over the course of the fall. And these students, I think, in fact, I'm quite sure, were quite deeply invested in the campaign. That said, they also had to listen to me over the course of it, and I think I probably have a somewhat different take on a lot of these questions, in part because I do stand at the intersectional space of being an African-American woman and a scholar of African-American feminism, of Black feminism, and therefore rarely do things like say race or gender, because I live them both and study them both simultaneously. So for example, I am not even vaguely surprised by the idea that sexual assault would be a not disqualifier for the American presidency. In fact, was mostly irritated every time people would say, oh God, we can't have a racist be the American president, because I kept wondering since when? In fact, for most of American history, racism has been a prerequisite to win the American presidency. One had to actually demonstrate one's racism in order to become the American president. And the same was certainly true of sexism and even of sexual assault. Well, I certainly don't want to make any parallelism between pussy grabbing and the behavior of actually I want to make some parallelism. I want to call it maybe just 1.5 standard deviations worse. But I do want to just remind us that at the beginning of this election cycle, the Anita Hill story was returned to us as a topic of political discourse. We marked it. And that the marking of the Anita Hill story and the confirmation of Clarence Thomas reminds us that despite his current stance on the question of sexual assault, that Joe Biden participated as a member of the Senate Confirmation Committee in a kind of discursive violence against a Black woman's body in a deeply distressing space, so much so that it became the initiation more than 20 years ago of the Year of the Woman for women running for office. And while he is certainly not that dude anymore in public space, quite the opposite, he's also never picked up the phone and frickin' apologized to Professor Hill, which couldn't possibly be that hard to do. And so our willingness to be forgetful, I'll also remind us that this is a country whose media, which was all up in arms about pussy grabbing, had basically no coverage of the Daniel Holtzclaw case. An officer who systematically sexually assaulted and raped Black women in this country. I will remind you that in this country, just prior to the election, MSNBC brought a certified liar back to air and sat him next to a Rhodes Scholar, so that every single debate, you saw a brilliant woman next to a sort of meh dude, so that your nightly news was brought to you by the thing that your debate was. So we are actually primed by the things that we see to not be particularly concerned. On the liberal side, on the conservative side, about the violence against women's bodies. And so what I will say is my students are appalled, they're harmed, they're hurt, they're in pain, they have angst, but they also have me as their professor. So I am constantly trying to put these things in historical context for them, which I think maybe is just more hurtful and painful, but hopefully also will turn them into brave warrior princesses.
That's great. We have just a few minutes for questions, so maybe we can just take a couple. People are walking around with microphones. Go ahead, I see a hand on the way back there.
One of the things that I'm surprised that I haven't heard, which seems to me obvious, is that at this point in America, no woman could be elected president. And I think that's the reality. I don't think you could take Mother Teresa, Einstein, and Angela Merkel and put them all in one body, and she could get elected in America.
I think Ivanka Trump's got a good shot in 8 years.
No, seriously. If you can seriously address that, I think it would be worth it.
Jen, Margie?
I mean, that's not what people like to believe about themselves. We have Americans have an aspiration to want to be able to vote for a woman. Now, we don't know. We only have an N of one, really, in terms of, a nominee, I should clarify. So it's hard to know. But it does, at least at the very bare minimum, reflect that people feel at least the social pressure to say that they'd be open to voting for a woman. And that's different. That's changed over decades. So now you have a record number of people, 80% of people saying that they'd vote for a woman, that America's ready to vote for a woman. You have similar numbers. You also have about same numbers say that there'll be a woman who will be president in their lifetime. And a couple different polls have shown that. So whether or not that's true is hard to know it in the abstract, but we can know with some certainty that people want to believe about themselves that their support for Clinton or lack of support for Clinton had nothing to do about their gender. That's going to be true for some people. It's not going to be true for everybody, and that we're going to have to we can take some people at their word that they are open and want to vote for a woman. So that's at least some good news going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also add, we did see some amazing women win this cycle, and I think that's really important to remember and to highlight. Across the country, women of color, women in the Senate, that are really going to be pushing the boundaries. Now they're going to be doing it from the minority, unfortunately, but I think that we have a much broader playing field when we think about young women and women from diverse backgrounds that are representing us. So I think it's incumbent on us to really figure out where they won, what happened. Places like Nevada and California and New Hampshire, and really spend some time thinking about that. And this isn't all about tactics, but it's certainly about what was done differently and how did they break through. And so my belief is that yes, today I'm not hopeful that there is the perfect path for a woman to run in 2020, that we won't be up against the same thing, but at the same time, I think there's still key elements underneath the surface here that have strong women leaders that were elected in big races that we can't forget.
Great. Well, on that hopeful note, we're going to hand it off to the next panel. I want to thank Melissa Harris-Perry, Jen O'Malley-Dillon, and Margie O'Mara. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margie, Jen, Melissa. Thank you, Peter. Next up, a case study of sorts. Speaking of women who won, Governor Maggie Hassan, who knows what it takes to run a challenging campaign. The New Hampshire Democrat just won her bid for the Senate, and she's here to tell us about the lessons she learned on the campaign trail, how it might influence the way she approaches her new job on Capitol Hill. Please welcome the senator-elect. She is here with the Atlantic's Washington Bureau Chief, Yoni Applebaum. Yoni's? Hi, Governor. Yoni, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us this morning. And welcome to Washington, Governor Hassan.
Thank you very much.
A pleasure to have you here. One of the things that I've been thinking about is something that occurs to me every 4 years, which is that there's 50 states in the Union and none of them is quite like New Hampshire.
I'm glad you recognize that.
So what are the things that enable so many women office holders to thrive and succeed in the Granite State?
Well, I am very proud as a Granite Stater of the way we approach self-governance in public life, which is that we just have an incredible culture and history of civic engagement and lots of opportunity for it. As you know, I will be part of the first all-female and all-democratic federal legislation in the history of our country. And one of the reasons that we see so many women in leadership in New Hampshire, I think, is just the sheer opportunity for women to engage, whether it's at school board, a conservation commission, or in our state legislature, which you may know consists of 400 members who are all volunteers. They get paid $100 a year. And so that really gives people a chance to kind of try public service out and see how they like it. And I think what happens is that women discover that they're good at it, that they make a difference, that they can engage with other people well and problem solve. And that really leads to more and more women getting involved. And you know, when I was sworn in as governor in 2013, I was sworn in by a female Chief Justice in a ceremony presided over by a female Speaker of the House. At that point in time, too, we had just elected our first all-female federal delegation. And that's very common in New Hampshire, just this sense that everybody pitches in, and as long as you're willing to work hard, we really don't look very much beyond that.
So you got your start in the state legislature, but before you entered the Senate, you ran and lost. And although the Norman Rockwell version of this is you're the local diner or the coffee store, and constituent walks up and tells you what a great job you're doing, that there's another version of this, which is that there are 400 legislators, and each of them has several thousand constituents who want to tell them what they're doing wrong, loudly, insistently, and even when they're looking for their own private moments. Why would you run a second time, having put yourself forward for the state Senate and experienced the rough and tumble of politics?
Well, so first of all, and I think this is helpful, especially for women to hear who might be considering running for office. We had redistricting in New Hampshire in 2002, so we didn't really know what our legislative districts were going to look like till late. And I got a call almost literally at the 11th hour from the chair of the Democratic Party in New Hampshire saying, all of a sudden there's nobody running for state Senate in this seat. Would you be willing to run? We all think you'd be good at it. I had been on an education financing commission. And then she said at the end of the conversation, and by the way, you have 24 hours to decide because that's the filing deadline. And I called my husband and listed all the reasons that it wasn't going to work. Our kids were 9 and 13. Our oldest has very severe disabilities. I had a part-time law practice, and I commuted some to Boston for that practice. And he had a very busy job. And I went through the whole list, and my husband said, but you know, you'd be really good at it, so we'll make it work. So that's a little bit of a piece of advice to women who are considering this. You know, surround yourself with people who will support you in this endeavor. It makes a big difference. And then secondly, as to your question, I was absolutely convinced from the campaign in 2002 that my district was a centrist problem-solving district. And the incumbent who I lost to in 2002 was really very far to the right of that. And I really felt that if I'd had more time and experience to have that conversation with voters and make my case and engage them more, that they would choose a different state senator just because I felt that the incumbent was such a bad fit for that district. And in fact, that's what happened in 2004.
Let me back you up a moment there. Aside from the Democratic Party operating with its usual organization and foresight and springing the question on you with 24 hours to go, you also said that you had gotten into this in part through educational advocacy, right? Working as an advocate for your son, getting involved in educational finance. Talk about that transition, right? Because there's one version of political engagement, which is getting involved in an issue that you feel passionately about, and you're out there pushing for the best possible solution. There's another version of political engagement, which involves going to a state legislature and making a series of painful compromises and learning a whole lot about issues about which you never previously cared. Right. And you made that leap from one to the other, and that's often a difficult leap for women in politics to make. Yeah.
Well, I think what has always been important to me is, I guess for me, the advocacy I did around including children with disabilities in public schools, and also in making sure that families who included children or family members with disabilities could also be included in the community and could also have a typical life. That experience really, for me, was just a model of what democratic small d progress means, which is that our founders set out the principle that every single one of us counts, that every single American, every single Granite Stater matters. And they didn't really count everybody at first, right? But they had the confidence that over the course of generations, we would bring more and more people in from the margins, which is good for the cause of human dignity and freedom, to be sure, but they also knew it would unleash a kind of talent and energy that would build a more successful community, democracy, and economy, and so that it was important to everybody's success. So that model for me is a model that I found myself wanting to bring to other conversations. It's not just about people with disabilities. It's not just about making sure we have, gender equity. It's not just about diversity. It's about strengthening everyone. And so the transition for me just was along those lines, which is the job in American life of public service is to engage and problem solve in a way that just unleashes more and more talent and energy so that everybody can thrive.
Often when I talk to women in elective office, they present their careers in just this way, as a series of problems that they set out to solve, of achievements that they have racked up, of working collaboratively and cooperatively, often across partisan lines. Stop me if this isn't a fair way to characterize what you've just said. Do you see that pattern too, that women often run on a record of achievement, maybe even more than male candidates tend to?
Well, I think women tend to get involved because they want to make a difference about a particular issue, or they've had an experience that has made them feel like people are ignoring a particular issue that's not only important to them and their families, but usually to their community, the greater community too. And so I think that generally has been the draw for women, which is, how do I fix something, as opposed to, gee, this is something I've always wanted to do.
So the way you're painting this, it leaves this question. You've just joined, what's often called the nation's most exclusive club. There's just 100 United States senators. Of course, there's a club within that club of the women in the United States Senate, which is not the 50% of the population that is true of the nation at large, quite a bit smaller. Right. Given what you've just laid out, women going out there, solving problems, moving from their own communities to broader elective office, why is this trajectory so comparatively rare?
Well, I'll start by just saying that I think, first of all, balancing the things that women generally balance, family, community, career, and doing it under the microscope of a very competitive political race is still something that women don't have that much experience doing. And I think it's really, we need to have more women run for office at all levels. So as women, we see other successful women doing this and being successful and being able to get through a campaign that can be contentious and difficult and occasionally personal. And I think the more we do it, the more we will see people succeed. That's one of the things about New Hampshire, is the more we have seen women run, as somebody who looked at the research once said to me, the more you elect women, it kind of gets contagious. And it isn't, I don't think it's a surprise that, Hillary Clinton back in 2008 won the primary in New Hampshire. New Hampshire voters were used to women leaders. I don't think it's an entire surprise that Jean Shaheen and I have both been governors and now senators. I think that that's something that people in our state have seen and gotten used to. So I think if we can help more women run, I think we will see more women become governors, more women become senators, more women become leaders throughout. I am reminded that I was calling a colleague, a state senator, after I first became governor about some issue. And he called me back later. I tried to reach him on his cell phone, and he has 2 daughters. And it turns out he was driving when I called, and the 2 daughters were in the car with him. And they saw that it was me calling, and they said, "Dad, the governor's calling you." And he said, I'll call her back when I'm not driving. So, smart, right? So then one of them said, "Dad, have you ever considered being governor? And he said, well, you know, people ask me from time to time whether I want to run for governor, and I've thought about it. What do you girls think? And one of his daughters said, well, no, you can't do that. And he said, why? And they said, because you're not a girl. And which tells you, I mean, here are these young girls who've really, you know, I was the first governor that they were really aware of. And that's actually not an uncommon, you know, kids in New Hampshire generally do not see this as an anomaly.
Role models are incredibly important. It reminds me that my daughter asked me at one point this fall why there are no women presidents. Was it because women weren't strong enough or because they weren't smart enough?
Yeah.
What lesson do you take away from this presidential election?
Well, I first of all want to remind especially young women and girls that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by almost 3 million votes. So she is the first woman in United States history not only to be her party's, a major party's nominee, but to win the popular vote for the presidency. And as heartbreaking for those of us who supported her found the election result, I don't think we should lose sight of that. And part of the real lesson in public life is that tenacity and persistence matter. Taking a hit from time to time and not having things go your way is a part of this process. And it doesn't mean you stop trying. And that really, you know, I always go back again to my roots as an advocate for my family, which is that, you know, the reason my son was included in public schools in Exeter, New Hampshire, was because generations of families and their advocates before the Hassan family pushed hard at a time when most people thought my son, whose name is Ben, and he's really handsome and smart, Ben is 28, and he can't speak, he can't walk, he can't really use his hands. So communication is very limited. He can raise a hand to say yes. A couple of generations ago, people would have thought that he had no cognitive ability because he couldn't communicate. We have come so far, but it has not been a straight trajectory, and it has not been without struggle. And you can pass a lot of good policies, but if you don't work on a daily basis about implementing them, they won't really have much meaning. Passing a law that says all children like my son have a right to a free and appropriate education is a monumental step that took a lot of advocacy and a lot of examples. But implementing that over the course of time is really hard. I mean, including somebody as disabled as my son is in your home is really hard work. And so is democracy. And that's one of the things that I think we can't lose sight of. And I actually think it's one of the strengths that women bring to the role. Because many times in our lives, things have not been a straight trajectory. And we get up the next day and we go forward. And that's really what I take from this election. We made great progress, but nobody is immune from disappointment, and nobody is immune from a complex election cycle where there were a lot of different forces at play and a lot of different things happening. And we get up the next day and we move forward because we have learned from this, and we have shown that a woman can in fact not only be a nominee, but win the popular vote.
You're moving forward now from a role as an implementer, a role as somebody who's working in an executive capacity, and going back to work as a legislator, and not just a legislator, but one in an embattled minority. What are the different skills that those roles call for?
Well, I'm really excited about my new role, and I also love being governor. And so one of the things that I think is really important is remembering that it is possible, and governors do this a lot, to work across party lines and get things done. And so in New Hampshire in the last 4 years, my first term, we have 2-year terms in New Hampshire. My first term, I had a Republican Senate, a Democratic House. My second term, I had Republican majorities in both chambers. That being said, we were still able to balance 2 budgets in a fiscally responsible way, holding the line against a sales and income tax, which is really important to Granite Staters. We still invested in critical economic priorities. We settled major litigation around our behavioral health system and move forward in reinvesting in community-based behavioral health. We managed to come together and fund critical transportation infrastructure, bipartisan development. We came together and passed a bipartisan Medicaid expansion program, so now over 50,000 hardworking Granite Staters have access to health care, including behavioral health and substance abuse treatment. We got emergency funding passed at the state level and changed a number of critical laws at the state level to combat our heroin and opioid crisis. And we actually froze college tuition at our public universities for the first time in 25 years and lowered it at our community colleges. So it is possible to get things done across party lines. And I reasons, as a sitting governor, I made the decision to run because I think we can do a lot at the state level, and it's really critical. Governors do incredibly critical work with their state legislatures. But if Washington is unable to take the same approach, there's only so much you can do as governor. And I'm looking forward to adding to the caucus of senators who have been governors, because I think, again, it's a bipartisan group, and we have experience about how what happens here really impacts people in their daily lives, that we understand in a very direct and precise way.
So many of your colleagues in the Senate are facing something of a dilemma at the moment where they may be inclined to this kind of bipartisan cooperation, but they're faced with the prospect of cooperating with a chief executive who ran a campaign that many of them abhor, that they feel, particularly on issues of gender, that he represented himself and through his words and his past conduct in ways that some of them feel disqualifies him from the presumption of good faith or cooperation, whereas others are inclined to see what they can accomplish. Where do you come down on that?
Well, I think the relationship between the president and the Congress is obviously one that is still forming and evolving. I will never fail to stand up to Donald Trump around critical issues of principle or when I think it is in the best interests of my constituents in New Hampshire to do so. They elected me to bring New Hampshire values and New Hampshire pragmatism to Washington. I also know how important it is that we continue to find ways to make progress wherever we can. So when it is in the interests of my state and my country to work with the president-elect, I will do that. When I think he is violating our basic values and tenets, I will certainly stand up to him.
We'll move to audience questions in a moment, but before we do that, I just want to ask, there are many women in this audience who perhaps are contemplating running for public office themselves. And I wondered if you can tell me two things. What the biggest delight or surprise of actually doing that was for you, but also what the thing that you had to give up that cost you the most was?
Oh, my goodness. So first of all, as I have often said, other than marrying my husband and having my children, running for public office is the best thing I have ever done. And so people should just know what an opportunity it presents. It particularly presents itself in a state like New Hampshire, but I am quite certain the experience is replicated in each state's unique way across our country. The opportunity to engage with your fellow citizens about things that matter to them is extraordinary. And you know, when you are running for office and then when you serve in office, people are so willing to share with you what their lives are like, what matters to them, what their hopes and dreams are. It is just an extraordinary honor, and you learn something from those conversations every single day. And it makes you, you know, it helps you develop a more complete outlook. I think it makes you a better problem solver, a better person. And you know, you end up, if you're doing it well, you end up growing no matter where you started from. And if you do it well, the people of your state and you grow together around certain issues. It is a challenge to learn also, just as people are sharing with you, to share your own personal self with others. You know, especially if, like a lot of women, I suspect, I don't want to overgeneralize, you've been raised not to make a fuss and not to draw attention to yourself. And so that's one of the, you know, that's one of the things you have to work on. But it is an extraordinary, extraordinary experience, and even in the heat of disagreeing with people passionately in governing, again, they are sharing themselves with the people of the state and with each other to try to make things better. And that's what ultimately makes me so optimistic about our future.
And worth the price of a public that feels it owns a part of you, or is entitled to
You know, I mean, again, New Hampshire is a very interactive and engaged place. And so, you know, by the time you've campaigned for any office, but especially statewide office, you've met a lot of people, and they don't ask anything from you that they don't ask of themselves.
Right. Well, we've got a few minutes here. Some questions?
Okay.
Hi, I'm Denise Ferriozzi with Emily's List. Thank you for everything you've done and will do. I have a question about running as a woman, running for a legislative office versus executive office. We've obviously seen a lot of progress, not enough, you know, in Congress and in state legislatures, but have been halted at executive office. And as someone who's run successfully for both, I'm wondering if you saw, if the voters of New Hampshire, you think, evaluated you differently for those jobs.
Well, I certainly think that women are still perceived differently. And I do think that at times, at least, we are held to higher standards. And I think we don't have as much experience in daily life and in business having women chief executives. So again, I think it goes back to people doing it more and more, and citizens having role models themselves to see. I have held, you know, I was in the state Senate too, so I've held both legislative and executive office. And I think one of the things that's true about New Hampshire is that even the chief executive in New Hampshire, the way our government is structured really requires a very collaborative approach, because governors have a lot of legislative oversight, and we have something called the Executive Council, which has to vote on much of what we do too. So I think we may be a unique place in that regard, but I do think that we still need to see more women become chief executives so people get more used to it. But again, I think Hillary's run has really helped people see a very strong, able person, and they clearly believe she'd make a very able chief executive.
Hi, Jessica Grounds. Thank you. Hi, Jessica Grounds with Project Mind the Gap. Governor Hassan, you ran in a very high-profile race against another woman candidate. How did that change the strategy for your team at all? Did it change your strategy in any way, running against another woman? And also, did it bring up issues impacting women and gender differently, do you think, during the course of the race? And lastly, I would just say, do you feel badly at all that you took out one of the few Republican women in the Senate?
The answer there is no. Look, I ran for this office because I really believed New Hampshire wasn't being represented in the way it needed to by my opponent, whose service I appreciate very, very much. And I appreciate the significance of the campaign we just ran. And my opponent and I have known each other a while, and but I ran for this seat because I really believed that we need to help continue to grow a thriving middle class. We need to support innovative businesses. We need to keep our country strong, safe, and secure. But we need to make sure that we are also protecting a woman's right to make her own reproductive health decisions, for example, and that we need to keep moving forward and improving the Affordable Care Act and addressing some of its shortcomings. But I ran for this seat because I really believe we need to bring the New Hampshire way of getting things done and investing in people and growing the middle class to Washington. And that continues to be what I'll focus on here. I do think that a high-profile race between two women meant that I thought that there was a narrative about the race, about it being particularly negative, that I'm not sure they would have written about two men running against each other. And so, it was a tough race, but it was a high-profile race in a hotly contested seat in a very close election in a purple state. And so I do think that we continue to see female and male candidates perceived somewhat differently and addressed somewhat differently. And again, I think the more women run and the more we point out those moments when we really don't think, for instance, the coverage is focusing on the appropriate things or in a gender neutral way, that we'll continue to see progress there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Governor Hassan, and thank you, Yoni. Next is a session presented by our underwriter, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, and the foundation's partner on the 2016 Presidential Gender Watch Study, the Center for American Women in Politics. They're calling this session Playing the Gender Card When the Deck is Stacked. For that, please welcome the Center for American Women in Politics' Kelly Dittmar. Hi, Kelly. And Adrienne Kimmel of the Barbara Lee Family Foundation. They are here with the founder and president of the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, Barbara Lee herself. Welcome, Barbara Lee. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. This is so exciting to be here. I have lots of friends in the audience from all parts of my life, and all of them who are committed to women's leadership. As you heard, I'm Barbara Lee, founder and president of the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, and we are so glad, again, that you are all here. I've already lost a card. So I want to start with a question that's likely on the mind of everyone in this room. What will it take to elect a woman president in the United States? Over 70 nations have been led by women, so why not us? For almost 20 years, my foundation has been the only organization to have an exclusive focus on studying the campaigns of women running for executive office. We've analyzed every woman's general election campaign for governor on both sides of the aisle all the way back to 1998. Why study governors? Because the governor's office is a traditional launchpad to the presidency. And it's the best test case scenario that we have available to learn exactly what it takes to elect a woman commander-in-chief. The gender dynamics that we so often see in women's races for governor were on full display in this presidential election. In fact, my foundation's research has consistently shown that voters hold women executive candidates to a higher standard. Voters scrutinize women's qualifications, their personalities, their voices, and even their faces. Over and over again in focus groups, voters would say, well, I would vote for a woman, just not that woman. So it wasn't a surprise when Donald Trump said a woman didn't look presidential. In April 2015, anticipating that at least one woman would run for the presidency, we partnered with the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers University, and together we launched Presidential Gender Watch to offer real-time analysis about the role of gender in the 2016 presidential campaign. Our experts, our guest scholars, and practitioners have been providing research-based, nuanced insight into the question, what role does gender play in presidential politics? This morning, we would like to share key takeaways from the 2016 campaign. First, the specific obstacles and opportunities for women presidential candidates. Second, the role of women voters who, contrary to many media reports, did not abandon Hillary Clinton, but rather embraced her. And third, the impact of hypermasculinity on this race. Joining us today are our experts who led our Presidential Gender Watch Project, Dr. Kelly Dittmar, scholar at the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers University, and Adrienne Kimmel, Executive Director of the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, who has worked with me on our research for the past 7 years. Adrienne, let me hand this off to you.
Thanks so much, Barbara. I'm going to pick up right where Barbara left off and talk about some of the key takeaways for our Presidential Gender Watch Project. As mentioned earlier, for the first time in history, we saw 2 women vying for the top of the ticket in both major parties. 2016 provided us with a chance to really examine what happens when women are running for the nation's highest office. Do women candidates change the conversation? How do male candidates position themselves when the gender dynamics change? And as Barbara noted, voters do continue to hold women candidates to a different standard. So how did that play out in 2016? First, our foundation released research last year that focuses on candidates and likability. We know that voters expect women candidates to be likable, but they're willing to vote for a male candidate who is not. I can't even keep track of how many "is she likable" enough pieces I read about Hillary Clinton over the past year. And the likability question isn't specific to any one woman candidate. There was actually a headline, "Even a room full of puppies can't make Carly Fiorina likable." And some of you might remember, in the Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders was kind of seen as the grumpy grandpa, and that was lovable, not unlikable. In the final days before the election, Clinton and Trump had comparable favorability numbers, but likability was a non-negotiable for Clinton and not so for Trump. Perhaps one of the biggest double standards we saw play out during the election deals with when voters perceive women as dishonest, or unethical. Voters put women on a pedestal when it comes to morals and honesty. There's an expectation of purity and virtue for women. Even a perceived infraction can cause women to tumble off the ethical pedestal that voters place them on. And this means that voters remember and punish women more for even a hint of perceived wrongdoing. And that expectation does not hold true for male candidates. They're really not on a pedestal, so the fall is quick, and there's not too much to climb back up onto. Trump's campaign used a tried and true method of character attacks and made Clinton's private email server the centerpiece for his campaign. Lock her up was a rallying cry for some Trump supporters, and Crooked Hillary was a mainstay of Trump's stump speeches and his Twitter feed. And those accusations were directly at odds with how we expect women to act, and the penalty is steep. While 2016 certainly illuminated the double standards that still exist for women in politics, it also shows what's now possible for women candidates. Clinton noted early on in her race, "I'm not asking you to vote for me because I'm a woman. I'm asking you to vote for me on the merits. And one of those merits is that I'm a woman." For the first time, we saw a woman presidential candidate truly embrace all of her experiences, professional, family experience, volunteer experience, to connect with voters. And it wasn't that long ago, you could even say in 2008, that talking about yourself as a daughter, a wife, a mother, or a grandmother on the campaign trail simply was not done. And that's not really the case anymore. Actually, in 2010, Barbara Lee Family Foundation research showed a shift in women being able to be called what we call the 360-degree candidate. Women have a broader opportunity to connect with voters, and it's not limited to just what's on their resumes anymore. So gender was just one of many factors that impacted the outcome of the election. Race, socioeconomic status, and partisanship, among other things, all played a role. However, what the events of 2016 have confirmed is that gender is an important piece of what's a complicated puzzle, creating challenges and opportunities for all candidates and influencing voter decision making. And Kelly will talk a bit more about that.
Recognizing that complexity was a key part of our work at Presidential Gender Watch, and we did that and tried to illuminate the complexity of gender throughout the primary and general election cycle. So I hope that you'll all go to our website, presidentialgenderwatch.org, and look back at the work that we've done, and also follow along with us through the transition. On Twitter, we're at GenderWatch2016. We're tweeting today. But if I could emphatically reinforce sort of two claims or themes throughout our work, I would choose these. First, women are not monolithic, whether as candidates or voters. And second, gender doesn't equal women. Too often, conversations around gender assume we're only talking about women and rely on singular characterizations of women as voters or candidates, characterizations that ignore the rich diversity that women bring, ideologically, generationally, and across race and ethnicity, religion, sexuality, just to name a few. When freed from these false constraints for understanding the politics of gender in presidential politics, the results of applying a gender lens to what happened and what continues to happen are broad, rich, and deep. So take the shock among many that white women didn't support Hillary Clinton, a reaction based upon the false presumption of gender affinity, that women would simply vote for women. Aside from the apparent amnesia about white women's support for Republican nominees in the previous 3 elections, many observers and pundits missed that Democratic women were just as unlikely to support a presidential ticket with a woman candidate on it in 2008 as Republican women were to vote counter to their party identification for a female-led ticket in 2016. Few people expected Democratic men to vote for Trump this year simply because they shared the same chromosomes, so perhaps we shouldn't apply the same logic to women either. And focusing on white women's votes misses the very important role that women of color have played in electoral politics. Black women, for example, voted at the highest rates of any race and gender subgroup in 2008 and 2012, as Melissa noted, proving to be an essential piece of President Obama's winning coalition. Latinas are among the fastest rising group of voters in the United States, and all of these women bring distinct priorities, perspectives, and positions, both between and within groups, that are too often lumped together by strategists, candidates, media, pundits, etc. Moreover, focusing on women tells only one part of the gender story. Looking through a gender lens requires understanding that gender shapes behaviors, evaluations, and outcomes of women and men. In 2006, this means that we need to realize that all candidates played the gender card, and perhaps Donald Trump most of all, and most overtly, in his performance of masculinity. I mean, this is a man who stood on a presidential debate stage and defended the size of his literal manhood. You also saw him try to emasculate his opponents, little Marco, weak Jeb, or reducing female opponents to their appearance. Look at that face, she just doesn't look presidential. In doing so, he tapped into or capitalized upon the feelings of precarious masculinity among voters, especially men, but also women, who felt, as The Atlantic and the Public Religion Research Institute found, that men and women should stick to the roles to which they are naturally suited, that society is becoming too soft and feminine, and that men are being punished just for being men. If we ignore that gender mattered in these ways and only focus our attention or analysis on women, we risk normalizing and perpetuating a gender status quo that not only disproportionately disadvantages women, but also constrains men's political behavior in ways that retains power in traditional models or modes of masculinity. So recognizing these complexities should serve as an important reminder that talking about the politics of gender, as we're doing today, shouldn't end with a woman's defeat. In fact, these conversations are perhaps more important now than ever, in the fact that election 2016 was, at least in part, a referendum on the re-entrenchment of presidential masculinity. And, in this case, traditional models of masculinity won. So we at the Center for American Women in Politics, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, and Presidential Gender Watch won't end the conversation here, and we hope you won't either. So let me turn it back to Barbara.
Thank you, Kelly. As Kelly said, this work does not end here today. We will continue to take stock of what happened in the 2016 presidential election, and that includes the good news and the bad news. Let me start with the bad news first. For those of us who watch this election through a gendered lens, the highest and hardest glass ceiling hasn't been shattered yet. Neither has gender bias, conscious or unconscious. As Susan Chira wrote in the New York Times, we are not living in a post-racial America. With the 2016 campaign, neither are we living in a post-gender world. Now for the good news. Hillary Clinton, the first woman ever nominated by a major party for the presidency, won more popular votes than any white man in history. During the debates, Hillary put issues like women's health care, pay equity, and paid family leave front and center like never before. And on a personal note, I am heartened by the thousands of young women who have become inspired to step up since Election Day to say that they will run for office in the future. That is a really big deal and good news for everyone. So we at the Barbara Lee Family Foundation and the Center for American Women in Politics will continue to ask the questions that will help women unlock the doors to executive office at every level, and especially the presidency. I want to thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Kelly, Adrian, and Barbara Lee. And now, for our last session, we want to look ahead and talk about the potential impact of the 2016 race on future elections. And for this conversation, please welcome Time Magazine's Jay Newton-Small, who recently wrote a book called Broad Influence, looking at how women are transforming government and politics. Hi, Jay. And CNN senior political reporter Nia Malika Henderson, and The Atlantic's Michelle Cottle is here to lead the conversation. Take it away, Michelle.
Thank you so much. So we are kind of the what did we learn from all this panel. And I think we'll touch on some lessons that could specifically be learned, but also like where do we go from here and how depressed should we be, or can we find a silver lining to all this? But I'll just start you off with like very briefly, what do you think, what role did gender play in this and the kind of dynamics and strategies?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah,
sure. So I think there were two. There were two roles on obviously the Republican side and the Democratic side. And the Democratic side, I would say, look, I mean, Hillary Clinton herself said she was a very flawed candidate. She wasn't the same sort of campaigner as Barack Obama was or as her husband was. But I also think that she did suffer from sexism that existed on the campaign trail, and we're just not used to hearing powerful women. So, Bernie Sanders could yell at you for like 40 minutes, and you'd be like, yeah, yell at me for 40 more. And Hillary would raise her voice, and everyone would be like, oh my God, she's so shrill. Like, why is mom screaming at me? And so there's that. I mean, it's going to take us, I think, a good generation of powerful women raising their voice and passion, talking about how they're really inspired to change the world in order for us to become accustomed to that and not think that they're shrill and screaming. I think there's also a lot of challenges that women still face with executive leadership. Sort of proving that they're tough enough while still remaining likable, and being able to soar in ways that men can soar. So Barack Obama could talk every day about the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice, and you're like, wow, that's so inspirational. Hillary really, it was very hard for her to reach altitude, and with her speeches, and you saw that with, like, for example, even her convention speech, people talked about how Michelle Obama's was so much more inspiring than Hillary's, why Hillary wasn't smiling enough during her convention speech. And that's frankly a sort of symptom of a lot of women running for executive office. If you think about women leaders in the world already today, Angela Merkel, Theresa May, Margaret Thatcher, I mean, these are not leaders who are soaring female orators. They're very pragmatic, and that is the role that we expect that we elect women in, is this almost like motherly role where they're very pragmatic. They're sort of the ones who sort of steel the spine of the nation and march on through whatever problem that is. And it's not the sort of inspirational roles that you see in most world leaders. And I think that's something that women are going to have to overcome, and really that's one of the big barriers. On the Republican side, I thought it was really interesting that sort of non-college educated white women, and I wish there was another way to say that because it always comes off as sounding like they're not educated, like they're dumb or something, and they're not dumb at all, and I want to sort of say that, but just the demographic of non-college educated white women was the one that really swung the most, and I thought that was really fascinating to see. Coming out of the convention and the Republican side, Kizir Khan, Trump was losing them, and this is a demographic that Mitt Romney won by 20 percentage points in 2012. They historically, since like Eisenhower's time, have gone for Republicans. Then they swung back to Trump after Kellyanne Conway took over, and she's like the Republican expert on electing women or getting the women's vote, and she really, she got him out there doing campaigning in Detroit, proving that he wasn't racist. She got him out there campaigning with his daughter and talking about women's issues. And by the time they were going into the first debate, they were tied. He was ahead with non-college educated white women, and they were tied overall in the polls. Then, of course, the groping allegations come around, they swing away, and then with Comey, they swung hard back, and he ended up winning them by 28 percentage points. It's a huge win. It improves Romney's margin by 8 percentage points, and they turned out in historic numbers for him. So I thought that was really just interesting that one demographic was the only demographic that consistently throughout the whole campaign swung back and forth between Hillary and Trump. So I think there's definitely lessons to be learned there as well.
In some ways, I'm sort of more interested in this campaign in terms of the way masculinity and maleness really played out here, with Donald Trump running as this uber alpha male candidate who literally talked about the size of his penis during the debate. You can't imagine Hillary Clinton talking about, I don't know, her bra size or something like that on stage. So here he was, really, I think, running as this unreconstructed man, right, from the 1950s in a way that Mitt Romney was caricatured as by Democrats in 2012, but in a way that I think Donald Trump embraced and embodied this year. His nicknames for different candidates, like Jeb Bush, he was low energy, which of course he really means he's low testosterone. Little Marco, Rand Paul, I've had it up to here with you. Rand Paul jokes about his height and stature and masculinity ultimately. So, coming into this race, the idea was that it would be Hillary Clinton who played the gender card, but really in many ways, I thought it was Donald Trump who played the gender card. We often think of gender in the same way we think of race as black people as the ones who have race, and women as the ones who have a gender. But I think in this instance, it was very much Donald Trump who was playing the gender card. And I also think there was an interesting intersection here in terms of gender and race in terms of Hillary Clinton. I think she ran really as probably the only Black Lives Matter candidate we've ever seen. She said Black Lives Matter. She embraced talking about race in a way that even Obama didn't. And I don't know if you guys have had a chance yet to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece on race yet. It just came out, or Obama, and one of the things he talks about essentially is that Obama never really made people feel bad about race, and I think with Hillary Clinton in talking about Black Lives Matter and being even a little bit more progressive in talking about race than Obama, I think that had an effect in terms of the way people thought about her, and a negative effect in terms of some of these voters we're talking about, working class white women, working class white men. So we saw, I think, some intersectionality at play with Hillary Clinton not only being a woman, but in some ways a candidate who was, not exactly blacker than Obama, but embracing racial rhetoric in a way that we hadn't seen from any candidate previously.
So now we watch this race, and I can't think of a campaign where there was a clearer contrast between, as you say, this, masculine, he oozed machismo, and he was kind of out there. We had all these, finally a candidate with balls you would see on everybody's t-shirt,
right,
or the really insulting things targeted at Clinton from his supporters. And then on the other side, you had a woman who was not just a woman, but who had spent most of her political life, especially early on, pursuing the rights of women and girls, and that's kind of what she was known for in the 90s and so on. And it turned out like this. So what kind of impact does this have going forward in terms of women wanting to run for office, people's concerns about gender politics from voters? I mean, I talked to people who study gender and politics before the race, and they were concerned that even if Hillary, assuming that Hillary won, and she had a rough road, that it would discourage people from more women from jumping into the ring. Kind of, where do you see this going?
I was surprised because after the election, I thought interest in my book would die down because it's a book about women going into the workforce, and I have a chapter on Hillary, and actually I saw a huge surge of book sales, and I was talking to Debbie Walsh from the Center for American Women in Politics last week at another event, and I was like, have you seen a surge in this? And she was actually like, yeah, they do a training, I think in January every year, and like usually around this time, maybe 10 people have signed up for 10 women interested in running for office, and they've got like I think 80 or 90 women already signed up for that training. So anecdotally, like talking to Emily's List, talking to other groups, even the Republicans on the Republican side, you see a huge surge of women interested in running for office, interested in these issues, and I think it has the potential. I mean, obviously it's a while before the next election, but it has the potential to be like another year of the women, where having the positive, like women being elected to office has not seemed to stir more women running for office in the same way that the negative does, where it was the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings and the grilling of Anita Hill by the all-white, all-male Senate Judiciary Committee that really spurred thousands of women to run for office in 1992 and created the first year of women, where you saw the number of women in the Senate triple, the number of women in the House increased by 50%, thousands of women ran for local offices. And so I think that you see this really activated, educated women who, most of whom voted for Hillary, who felt that their votes were not registered and not heard, who are very, very angry about that, and they want to do something about it. And so I do think you are seeing an interesting surge. I don't know hopefully it'll continue and ride into the 2018 elections. The difference there is that 91, we were going to a presidential election in 92. This time around, it's an off year. 2018 is congressional elections, where traditionally women don't vote as much as they do in presidential years. So there are a lot of hurdles to really sustaining that momentum, but we'll see. I mean, I think it could be potentially a very interesting year for electing women.
Yeah, I think that's right, because now the question is who's going to be the first woman president, right? And there are all sorts of predictions. Once Obama got elected, and Gwen Eiffel, I would be remiss in not mentioning her. May she rest in peace. We all loved her. She wrote that fabulous book, The Breakthrough, after Obama was elected, and chronicling sort of the next generation of potential African-American senators and leaders and governors. And in many ways, a lot of those folks flamed out, and there weren't any coattails from Obama in terms of African-Americans necessarily rising through the ranks of politics. But I think with Hillary Clinton, because the ground is already there in some ways, and there are folks in the Senate, folks in the House, folks in governors' mansions who can become the first woman president. So, we just had Maggie Hassan here. You wonder about somebody like Kamala Harris, Tulsi Gabbard, and folks like that. The woman who's going to be the UN, Nikki Haley
in South Carolina.
So yeah, I mean, I don't think this is going to put a damper on folks at all. But you do wonder, the tendency always, even in this election, is to always sort of look at the bench and where is the bench? Who are the unlikely candidates who we aren't thinking of, sort of the male or female version, and Democrat version or Republican version of Donald Trump, who was a very unlikely candidate and certainly not on any Republican bench. So yeah, I mean, one of the things I think we learned in this campaign is that the experts were wrong. I mean, I was wrong, folks at CNN were wrong. I hate to admit it, but I think about that every day. And there's this whole world of folks out there who aren't always part of the conversation. And so likely there's somebody out there who we don't know, who we aren't thinking about, who is entering the pipeline and could make a real run.
And as far as more strategic lessons learned, like if you were looking at an actual campaign, I mean, is there any lesson to be learned in terms of strategy or messaging or how to approach or what to take, not to take so much for granted or what to do differently?
I mean, I think don't piss off Vladimir Putin. I mean, that might be one. That's the whole thing. I mean, we always go into this with sort of, they're all the political playbook, and even, Barbara Lee has all of these, the Barbara Lee Foundation has all of these ideas about what you have to do as a woman president and or as a woman candidate. But I think what we know is that the rules don't necessarily apply. But maybe it's also true the rules don't apply to men, but maybe they do apply even more strictly. They really apply now to women. I mean, that might be a takeaway.
Well, now here's kind of, not a partisan question, but going forward, you mentioned Nikki Haley. We just had a race. I had talked to Republican women for a few years, especially after Mitt Romney lost, and especially within the establishment, a lot of Republican women were working so hard to change the party's image as not a friendly place for women. Now, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that Trump did not necessarily forward that goal all that well, although maybe he did, I don't know.
He did fine with women.
So where does that leave that effort? Or does it just send the message that it doesn't matter, you can win, with an unreconstructed Trump?
I think you're going to see a lot of challenges for Republican women, particularly in the House, moving forward. So I had lunch with Sarah Chamberlain from the Republican Mainstream Partnership a couple of weeks ago, and she said, given the number of Republican women, first of all, they've lost a couple of seats, so they're down to I think 21 in the House right now, which is less than 8% of the conference, which is just unbelievably bad compared to more than 60 Democratic women in the House. And with all the retirements, you're going to see Kathy McMorris Rodgers potentially go become Interior Secretary. There's a bunch of those women who are going to run for higher office in various states. And you're potentially going to see the female representation for Republicans in the House reach like World War II levels, right? Like, so it's so bad that you're going to go under 20, you're going to go maybe even to like close to 15, which is pretty much dismal. I mean, that's really awful. And that's tough. I mean, this is a group that really has had a hard time getting elected through Tea Party primaries. For whether it's fair or not, women are perceived to be more moderate, and in order to get through Tea Party primaries on the Republican side, it's been very hard for them. And now, like obviously in the era of Trump, like all of the recommendations from the 2012 autopsy were completely upended, right? And that has sort of compounded the problem that they face with this. And obviously there are efforts the Republican Mainstream Partnership is one, but then also I think Christine Toretti has a group, Brittany Thune has a group. I mean, there's all these sort of efforts that are popping up on the right to try to help women through the primary process, but it's a very slow going process, and it's nowhere near the kind of Emily's List on the left where they really clear primaries for you and they equip you to run for office and help you fundraise and do all these things.
Now, do we have any sense yet of how the Trump administration will be, what kind of place it will be for women? I mean, from what you've seen with appointments or talking to people, I mean, do you have any sense yet, Neil?
I mean, everyone talks about Ivanka Trump, right? Whenever you talk about women, and she, of course, gave that speech at the RNC convention this summer, where if you closed your eyes, you thought you were listening to a Democrat, right? And
to Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, to Hillary Clinton. She was talking about family leave and how the Trump administration would be great for women. And there's the story about Donald Trump handing the phone to Ivanka. I think maybe it was Pelosi he was on the phone with when she started to talk about women's issues. So, I mean, I guess that's a sort of outsourcing there going on with Ivanka. And the thing is, we don't know. I mean, if you look at the pics that are around him, immediately around him, not sure if Kellyanne Conway is going to get into the White House or not, or whether or not she's going to stay outside. So we don't know. I mean, can Ivanka push through some family leave policy through this Congress? I don't think we know. I mean, people obviously looking at abortion, defunding Planned Parenthood. People forget how popular Planned Parenthood is. It's like one of the most popular organizations in the country, far more popular than Congress, the press, Trump and Obama combined, probably. So I don't think we know, and that's the big thing. That was sort of the trick of Donald Trump. You don't know, like whatever you want,
Whatever
you
you
can
wanna
kind of look
project
at
onto
him and say, oh yeah, he's going to be great at that, because Ivanka's standing next to him, or whatever it is. So
So the hopes of the nation are wrapped up in the new president's daughter.
yes, Ivanka, who's lovely.
Well, that's very soothing.
Yeah.
And I think with that, we're going to toss to anybody in the audience, and I think we have microphones on the move. Right up front here.
Hi, Ashley Bergman from the International Republican Institute. So as someone who works in international development, I work specifically to get women involved in the political life in their respective countries. My question is, what does this mean for us abroad? And for those of us who work on women's empowerment abroad, especially in countries that look to us as an example, how does this affect our work in that field?
Well, hopefully the takeaway message was not that you can grow up women and still get elected to office. I mean, that's like my hope. I don't know. I don't know. That's a tough one. Selling this abroad. It's I certainly have heard from a lot of from when I covered foreign policy and from a lot of my sources abroad, very much concern about this, and talking to ambassadors who are coming back, who are career foreign service, who are very sort of waiting to see what this administration does before they decide that they want to go be the public face of that, going abroad. And I think you might see a lot of upheaval in the foreign service. But I mean, that's always like a tough job, especially if you're trying to sell something that you don't necessarily believe in. But I don't know that we know yet what they believe in. Like Nia was saying, maybe he'll become like a major champion for paid family medical leave and paid childcare, and that would be amazing. We just don't know. I mean, we'll see.
Hi, my name is Michelle Guapan. I actually worked for the Clinton campaign in Michigan.
What happened?
Yeah. It's a really good question. My question actually goes to the post-election talk on the Democrat side has been a lot about moving away from identity politics. And I know Bernie Sanders actually wrote a piece saying that we need to focus more on economics and less on personal identity. So I was wondering, based on both of your backgrounds, if you think that that's something that's practical to do, and if you think it will instead alienate who the Democrats already have on their side.
I think it's a good question. I guess Bernie Sanders doesn't see Donald Trump as running a campaign based on white identity, right? And you can argue that that's what he did, right? That he was the candidate of white grievance politics and talked about race and identity in a way that we haven't seen any candidate do over the last 20 or 30 years, whether it was him talking about Muslims in a disparaging way or talking about people who live in the inner city who go to the store and get shot.
Rapists.
Yeah, or
Mexican
rapists. So no, I think Bernie Sanders, is a socialist, and socialism has never really accounted necessarily for race, and he had his own kind of racial education during his candidacy. So the idea that he's coming back now to that Democrats should reject identity politics, I mean, it's a little odd, but I do think that is going to be the big question, and you can see that playing out with the race for DNC. Is it, or even the race for the leader of Democrats in the House, right? Mm-hmm. Is it white identity politics, sort of Rust Belt identity and the working class, which when people say working class, they really mean the white working class? Or is it somebody like Keith Ellison, right, who is more in the Obama mold, more of a Black Lives Matter candidate? I mean, I think we saw in both candidates play identity politics. It just worked better for Donald Trump because there are more white people in the country. He did exceptionally well with white people, exceptionally well with white working class folks. Hillary Clinton got 37% of the white vote. Obama got 39% in 2012 and something like 41% in 2008. So you do see the declining fortunes. for Democrats in terms of the white vote. So they do have to figure it out. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I think both played identity politics. I think it just worked better for Donald Trump, and it didn't work as well for Democrats because the numbers just weren't there. And I think, again, that Hillary Clinton ended up alienating some of those white voters who were uncomfortable with some of her rhetoric around race and gender.
Yeah. I also will say that, women make up 53% of the electorate, the voting electorate. We've, on average, vote 10% more in presidential elections than men do. And, and I will quote Kellyanne Conway here in saying that it's not identity politics when you make up the majority of the electorate.
I think we have time for just one more. Yeah, go for it.
Oh, hi. I'm Robin Leeds. I worked in the White House Women's Office under President Clinton back in the day. It seems like a long time ago. I wanted to raise 2 points and get your feedback. One is that we still don't live in a participatory democracy. I mean, when you look at the eligible electorate and who's participating and who's not. And that's a population that we really have to embrace. Why aren't people voting in America? And why aren't people that will vote for women and Democratic women voting in America? And we really need to take a closer look at our democracy and how it's not functioning. The other thing I wanted to ask about too is, as a Jewish woman, sadly, I see a lot of parallels to the rise of fascism in Germany and Europe. And I'm wondering if you see that, and if so, how that's playing out in 2016.
Which piece do you
I'll
want to
take the representative democracy piece. Sorry.
Nobody wants to go down the road. You're never supposed to bring up Germany or Nazi Germany in these things.
Yeah.
First rule of Monterey, you never bring up Hitler or Nazi Germany.
So, I would say it's very hard to drive out millions and millions of new voters unless you're voting for something positive. So, like, hatred of George W. Bush did not get John Kerry elected, and hatred of Barack Obama did not get Mitt Romney elected. And I think to some degree, and a lot of the sort of autopsies of the campaigns have borne this out, Hillary Clinton bet a little bit too much on hatred of Donald Trump. And she needed to present more of a positive, like, here's like inspirational, hopeful message that got people out and got young people activated, and inspired people. And I think it's very hard to get elected in the negative sense. And this was the most negative campaign, I think, in history, really. I mean, certainly in recent history. Yeah. And that, that in itself is pretty brutal. And yes, a lot of people did come out and vote. She won the popular vote by, I think, more than 2.5 million right now. But not enough people in the right places, like Michigan, came out and voted. And so she needed to present more of I think a positive message in those places. And I think that is a lesson that we need to remember and move forward, is that whenever people try to get elected in the negative, it never works. You have to, present some sort of hopey, changey thing, to quote Sarah Palin, that gets people, inspired and on board and fired up and ready to go. Because if you don't have that, then it's really, really hard.
All right, and I think that has to be the last one.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Great.
Well, thank
I didn't
you
have
so
to
saved by the bell.
Yeah. Stay for a couple more hours. We'll talk about all kinds of things.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. This is great. Thanks for coming,
Thanks,
guys.
Michelle.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Nia. Thank you, Jay. This is clearly rich territory to plumb, and we will continue to have these conversations over the next year. Thank you all so much for being here, for spending your morning with us. It means a lot that you took the time to be here. Thank you to the Barbara Lee Family Foundation for making today's event possible. I want to point out, as you walk out onto the balcony, the foundation's interactive photo and video exhibit is out there, and you can share your sense of and your experience over having a female major party nominee for the presidency. Before you go, I have one last request. You're going to get an email from me with a survey. There's some copies in the room as well. If you would take the time to fill them out, that would be wonderful. We really value your feedback, and it helps inform our work in the future. That's it. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you back here again soon.